Howdy everyone, Kazi here with another update to our Tank and Spank State of the Tanks on the Beta series. We finished up another weekend of testing, including getting to see a third Mythic Plus dungeon, 5 more Mythic bosses, and the first 7 bosses on normal, including their trash. We're definitely at the point in the patch cycle where the changes we're seeing are more tuning and bug fixes than complete overhauls of the systems, but we're still going to keep you updated on those changes and how they affect each of the tank specs. The last couple weeks, we've had some really great engagement from all of you in the comment section, and we really appreciate it. Keep those discussions coming, and if you like the content, consider subscribing and liking the video. Now, let's hop into it.
In the last week, Demon Hunter received damage tuning to a handful of their abilities. Immolation Aura damage was increased by 8%, Eye-Beam damage from Collective Anguish was reduced by 8%, the Hunt damage was reduced by 10%, and the bonus damage from Focus Cleave was reduced from 40% to 30%. The end result is a bit more AoE damage from Emo Aura and a bit less single target damage, but the difference isn't huge to either. 2 more talents in the class tree, Illidari Knowledge and Will of the Illidari, were buffed by 2% per point to 3% per point to magic damage reduction and maximum health respectively. This is a nice cherry on top to an already tanky class. Blizzard also buffed a couple talents on the right side of the spec tree. Fell Flame Fortifications damage reduction was increased to 10%, and Revel in Pain's maximum absorb was increased by 50% up to a 56k HP shield. I doubt either of these changes will do enough to make the talents worth taking at this point, and this is largely because the right side of the spec tree just isn't very favorable in Mythic Plus. Now, running a Fiery Brand build does have its upsides in Raid. On fights where you are only actively tanking the boss half the time, you can actually maintain Fiery Brand up for most of the time in which you're actually tanking, giving you a 40% damage reduction. Revel in Pain might see some play in these situations. Cycle of Binding was also buffed to reduce the cooldown of your sigils by 3 seconds when you hit an enemy with a sigil. This is a very weak buff to a talent that nobody is using. Sigils simply don't make up a big enough chunk of your damage and utility to warrant trying to force a point here. These changes overall aren't very impactful. Demon Hunters are still very strong tanks. They do great single target and AoE damage. They are simple to pilot and have a decent amount of choice and utility in their builds, and Feldev is definitely still a fun button to press.
Death Knight seems to be sitting in the back of the line waiting on tuning. They have undergone very few changes in the last couple weeks. A recent bug fix, however, did go a long way in addressing one of Death Knight's long-term weaknesses. Oftentimes, DKs have struggled with establishing snap threat on pulls. In Season 3 and Season 4 of Shadowlands, Death Knight benefited significantly from Survival Hunter being in the meta with a strong misdirect, but obviously you'd prefer to be more self-sufficient with threat. Now, thanks to the properly working interaction between Shattering Bone and Tombstone, that weakness seems to be shored up. Using Tombstone to immediately shatter 5 stacks of Bone Shield near the start of a pull is a big AoE damage nuke. When combined with Blood Boil and Death and Decay, this pretty much eliminates any snap threat issues. This is just one more example of how the new Blood Death Knight toolkit does a great job of rewarding well thought out play. Blood will probably never be the most new player friendly tank, in large part because if you die as a Blood Death Knight, there's a good chance it's because of a mistake you made 6 seconds ago instead of right at the moment you died. Having said that, DK is looking to be a solid choice for skill players.
Paladin saw some fairly significant nerfs to their damage through the class tree. Greater Judgment and Divine Purpose received 5% nerfs, while Seal of the Crusader was hit for 2% per point. The extension to your wings associated with Zealot's Paragon was halved from 1 second extension per Judgment and Hammer of Wrath cast to only a half a second extension. This hurts the synergy with Righteous Protector, which reduces the cooldown on Avenging Wrath based on holy power spent. You're just going to get less uptime on wings. Farron Marcus's Fervor now only increases Avenger's Shield damage to the primary target by 10% per point instead of 15%, and Focused Enmity had its bonus damage cut in half to 100%. Less damage from Avenger's Shield also means less shielding from Bulwark of Order. These changes heavily reduce the power of the single target Avenger's Shield build that I talked about in our last video. This is unfortunate because it likely means you won't be getting to play Moment of Glory, which is a really fun talent. Light of the Titans, the hot applied from healing with Word of Glory, also received a nerf to its healing being reduced by 25%. And of Dusk and Dawn is emerging as a very efficient use of 1 talent point. It's possible to have 100% uptime on both buffs for a somewhat passive 6% damage increase and 4% DR. The way things are currently shaping up, Paladins are capable of putting out big burst AoE damage. The spec is going to feel especially strong in Mythic Plus, where more targets means more Avenger's Shield and Tyr's Enforcer's damage. And this too also means more shields from Bulwark of Order, which is a very strong talent. Even with nerfs, using Judgment and Hammer of Wrath to extend your wings, and spinning Holy Power to reduce its cooldown is a fun playstyle that feels like it rewards smart play.
The big talk around Guardian Druid this week is a significant nerf to their Ursoc's Fury talent. Instead of providing a shield for 75% of Thrash and Maul damage, the talent now provides only 30% of the damage as a shield. Without a doubt, this means that compared to a week ago on the beta, Guardian is weaker. However, I'm not quite ready to sound the panic alarm just yet. Overall, I think in the long term, this change is healthy for the spec. Had so much shielding been left on Ursoc's Fury, the spec likely would have ended up being in pretty much the same spot it is on Live. By that I'd mean they'd be so incredibly strong and stout during Incarn that their tuning would require them to be weaker outside of Incarn to make up for it. Additionally, Ursoc's Fury would be so powerful that it would be nearly impossible for Blizzard to ever push the spec away from it with different tier sets and talent tuning. The class would have likely ended up tethered to the Ursoc's Fury and Incarn playstyle indefinitely. Now, with Bear weaker during Incarn, Blizzard can, in theory, increase their damage and survivability outside of Incarn. To be clear, this damage and survivability is already better on Dragonflight than it is on Live. I think that if we see the tuning knobs turned up on Mangle, Maul, and Moonfire, even if it's just bug fixes for Moonfire, this spec could end up being in a much healthier place than had they not nerfed Ursox to begin with. If they don't touch the rest of the tuning, though, this nerf would feel like a pretty big blow to Guardian stocks. Another place I think Guardian could really use some upward tuning would be in its cat weaving or boomkin weaving. Being able to stance swap and eke out a little bit more damage on boss fights where you have tanking downtime has always been a fun part of the Druid kit for higher end players. Unfortunately, only 2 bosses in the Vault of the Incarnates seem to have this as a realistic option, and even when you can swap to Boomkin or Cat, the DPS gain is negligible when you consider how much you're having to give up in the class and spec trees to make it work.
The changes to Monk in the last couple weeks has been as follows. Attenuation cooldown reduction can now trigger 10 times. Was 5. Yeah, that's it. As some of you pointed out in the comments after the last video, my update was a little lackluster. I mentioned that I felt monks were undertuned and got a little bit of pushback. One commenter recommended that I check out Equinox's video on monks. So speaking of that, there is a link to his channel in description down below. He put together some great monk videos and you should absolutely check them out if you're interested in monks. After educating myself a bit, I played a lot of monk in both Mythic Plus and Raid this week. I tried out this build and oh my gosh, what a difference. Let's talk about the things I got right first. Expel Harm does a lot of healing. Vigorous Expulsion, Profound Rebuttal, and Strength of Spirit help make it extremely powerful. You do unfortunately have to waste a point into Soothing Mist for a button that you'll never press, but that's alright, it is worth it. I do still think monks are on the squishier side, but the tier set helps with this. The 2-piece is simply a 4% DR from using Spinning Cranecake or Tiger Palm, but the 4-piece improves your Purifying Brew. Combine this with Light Brewing for reduced cooldown and Guy Pen's Imperial Brew and you'll get some added self-healing each time you purify, which is exactly what monks could use. Now into what I got wrong. I was definitely missing the interaction between Rushing Jade Wind. This with Bone Dust Brew and Exploding Keg and Resonant Fist. Rushing Jade Wind hits in small amounts very often. One cast hits a single target 13 times over 8 seconds. So Resonant Fist can currently trigger off of each instance of damage. Exploding Keg also has a chance to deal extra fire damage for 3 seconds after being cast. Each damage instance of Rushing Jade Wind has a chance to trigger this as well. So you can see your Rushing Jade Wind is triggering Resonant Fist, Exploding Keg, and use Bone Dust Brew on top of that for multipliers, and you're just doing an insane amount of damage. If the multiple procs are intended, and I'm not completely convinced that they are, then Monk AoE damage is great. I wouldn't be surprised if they add a proc flag to limit the amount that Resonating Fist is proccing, because it's just doing an insane amount of damage. It's your top damage in every dungeon. Charred Passions is also doing big AoE damage. And you get big uptime by talenting into Sal Sabim's Strength, so you can use Keg Smash to reset the cooldown of Breath of Fire. Your prio is keeping your Rushing Jade Wind up as much as possible, as well as your Charred Passions up with Breath of Fire and Cake Smash. You then Blackout Kick on cooldown, and use Spitting Crane Kick on 2 or more targets, and if you just have one target, you will use Tiger Palm. You can also use Tiger Palm anytime you need to reduce the reduction on your brews, if you need a Purify or a Celestial Brew coming up when you know you're going to take damage. Make sure that when your cooldowns come up, you cast Bone Dust Brew first before Exploding Keg so that you get the chance for the extra procs. Make sure Rushing Jade Wind is active before this cast. So this playstyle moves Monk away from the Ox build. It's currently doing less damage even if you sink points into the modifier talents. In the last week or two, Brewmaster Monk really hasn't changed much at all. But my opinion of them absolutely has.
Warrior received a pretty nice quality of life change this week with a slight redesign of the Blood and Thunder talent. Previously, the talent required you to have a rend active on a target in order for Thunderclap to spread it to 5 other targets. Now, as long as you're talented into Rend and Blood and Thunder, Thunderclap will apply up to 5 new Rends regardless of having a Rend out already. This probably came to pass because it was easier to change the talent than figure out the bugs that were previously plaguing it, but regardless of the reason, this feels really good to play with in AoE. You're no longer required to commit Rage and a GCD into a single target Rend early in the pool. Instead, you can just take Rend off of your bar and let it apply with your Thunderclap. This is admittedly a bit strange, considering Rend, even if you never cast it once, will end up being one of your highest overall damage abilities. We talked last week briefly about the strength of Unbreakable Will in Mythic Plus. There are currently several party-wide damage abilities in the dungeons we're testing that deal incredibly high damage. Whether these get tuned down in future patches is yet to be seen, but having Unbreakable Will in your back pocket feels really helpful right now. This has contributed to how the more dungeons I log with Warrior, the more it seems like the Warrior kit overall has the most tools to truly carry your group in Mythic Plus. Tuning will affect the damage of the tanks quite a bit, but the class kit is going to perform incredibly well in Mythic Plus regardless of whether they adjust the damage tuning.
Thanks everyone for watching. Coming up this week in testing, we've got Mythic Taros again for the second round. There may have been some changes to him. We also got Kirog Grim Totem. These are on Mythic difficulty. They should be opening up more Mythic Plus for us as we've only done 3 of the 8 dungeons that we're going to get in Season 1. It helps out, of course, if you like and subscribe. We've already started work on our tank deep dives, and we plan to release them probably between pre-patch and launch. So keep an eye out for that as well as we keep honing our craft. Thanks so much, and we'll see you in the next video.